Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we got a big one. We're going to be talking about the newest album from Björk called Utopia. So I've talked about breakup albums before on this series, many of which stand as some of the most evocative and emotional albums that an artist can make, delving into a relationship's collapse in real time and exploring the often complex situation to mine some sort of deeper meaning or closure for the artist and most often the audience as well. But what gets talked about a lot less is what comes after that, when the emotions behind the breakup are settled and while the relationship and memory of that ex might linger in the background, there are new paths and opportunities that must be explored going forward. Records that take this sort of direct, more sequel approach, they are a lot rarer, mostly because the emotional dynamic is actually a little bit trickier. The breakup provides the context for the journey of the album's protagonist and that arc, but it can't overshadow the primary emotions running through the album, and that's a pretty tough balance to walk, both in the lyrics and a lot of the performance. So enter Björk, one of the most boundary-pushing artists of the past 30 years and easily one of the most challenging. And while I've talked about how it took me a while to come around on a lot of her work, the past 2 years since I reviewed Vulnicura has only deepened my affection for her albums and her artistic process and how experimental she is. And while I was a little bit annoyed that one of her few creative partners on this project, Utopia, was Arca, an electronic producer who with every project and collaboration he continues to run out his clock in my books, I was very intrigued by where Björk wanted to take this. For one, she described this album as her Tinder record, where she was looking to find that new love and passion and explore it with technology, but she was also looking to explore and dissect some utopian ideals as well, the Paradiso de Vulnicura's Inferno. Now, I did have some reservations about this. Not only was this her longest album at over an hour, utopian ideas tend to be pretty tough to crack or make palatable in our quasi-dystopian world. But you know what, on the other hand, Björk is a genius. Her interviews before the album came out showed that she was plenty aware and capable of the difficult task and thematic dissection ahead of her, and considering the sonic palette was reportedly calling back to Vespertine, Björk's second best album after Post, I really was excited for this. So okay, what did I find in Utopia? Well, I'm of a few minds on this album. On the one hand, it's standing as a natural continuation and sequel from Vulnicura that draws upon a lighter, more vibrant tone and shows perhaps the best counterbalance for Arca that he has ever had. Utopia is a beautiful and frequently affecting listen. I did like this. But on the other hand, the more listens I gave it, the more I found myself wishing that there was more that really grabbed me, that I could love on a record that, yeah, it runs long and might not have enough of the variety or stunning melodies that made its predecessor so damn effective. And yeah, part of it will circle around some of the utopian themes and symbolism, because I know that some explanation is going to be demanded there, but ultimately it comes out that this record is more good for me than great. But before we get to that, let's start off with the compositions and production. And really, at this point in her career, you're either on board with Björk's fascinatingly rich vocal tone, full of trilled syllables, stunning expressiveness, and gorgeous multi-tracking, or you're not. And since I came around to her unearthly voice, there's a lot about her charisma and delivery I find plenty potent here, especially given the choral effects that she utilizes to gorgeous effect, particularly that male choir and the behemoth of the song Body Memory that works amazingly well. And while I'm inclined to give Arca some credit for it, the brittle rumbles and melodic instability have always been his hallmark. They definitely come through here, and he definitely gives these mixes enough space to breathe and give Björk the space she needs. The truth is that it's Björk who is the reason why so many of these compositions ultimately work, providing the real underlying compositional structure and control for her blur of samples and delicate arrangements, even if you do feel there's a little bit less structure this time around. And that will inevitably attract the most attention, because while the Vespertine comparison holds in the usage of strings and harp on songs like Body Memory and Tabula Rasa and Blissing Me, the much more prominent instruments on this album are woodwinds and flutes. Flutes from the high trilling notes of Courtship and Lost, the fuller, breathier tones, to elements that are intended more just to accent the mix, but do so in brilliant melodic fashion, all amidst a cloud of birdsong that blurs together the organic and technical in a way I haven't heard since I reviewed the album from Visible Cloaks called Reassemblage earlier this year, which is also pretty damn good. Now, Lost in particular stands out as one of the most pronounced moments of contrast that really worked for me. A crushing industrial rumble of a beat against a whirling melodic core with co-production from Rabbit emphasizing a groove element that Arca rarely uses, but really should use a lot more often. But of course, What this also means is that we're going to get some of the choppy, pitch-shifted vocal samples filling in for melodies in songs like Sue Me or Claim Staker. And while neither case is exactly bad in the production, they don't nearly fit in with the atmosphere that's a lot more lush in the same way, which might have been the point for the former song, but definitely not the point for the latter. And excusing how Björk's voice can top out at parts of Features Creatures, which is also a bit of an issue in the production. You didn't expect that sort of thing, given how lush and expansive the mix is. But the larger issue is that for as striking as the melodies were on Vulnicura, unorthodox for sure, but pulling from the wells of deeper, aching pain, the trembling instability on several of these tunes don't quite obscure the melodic compositions. They don't have the same evocative moments of climax, at least not consistently, and some of that does come from a lack of structure. Yeah, you get songs like Blissing Me and Lost, and especially Saint, that do hit that emotional swell and climax and crescendo, but as a whole, there's a part of me that feels like the flute arrangements can feel a little bit uniform, blurring together from song to song, which can become a serious problem when this record already runs over an hour, with extended outros or languid digressions that don't really add up to more in the individual piece. Now, the best of these digressions is easily the more contemplative, misty touches on the end of Courtship, but even then, when you tack on a pretty but inessential interlude called Paradisia, you start feeling some of the ideas are getting stretched rather thin, especially when you realize the moments where Björk is sampling herself on previous compositions from previous albums. But before we get down to some of those ideas, I need to lay down some context about utopian narratives, and for the most part, why I just don't really care for them, for two main reasons. Now, one, it can deflate tension. If you're looking to find a sense of drama to drive a compelling narrative, immersion in a more utopian ideal can feel, well, a little listless, a little deflating. It can cut back on momentum, especially when at number 2, nobody's utopia is precisely the same, and to suggest that your version of paradise is inherently superior to another's can have kind of an authoritarian twinge to it, especially if it involves pushing people away who might corrupt or taint your paradise. Now, to be clear, Björk is very much aware of both of these criticisms, and I like the subtext evidence on the early songs about this record in confronting new lovers. It's clear that she wants to elevate them to meaning so much more for her, but she doesn't want to do it at the expense of her partner's wishes and desires. And thus, when this record embraces a quieter sense of transcendence in swapping music and MP3s and bonding over art as a sign of that love, it's a really potent metaphor. For a music nerd like her, as she acknowledges, it's a pure form of love, and one that I really expect is very human of her. But she's also very acutely aware of her history, the ex in the picture for which some of that pain still lingers as she tries to move forward with no desensitization in the era of Tinder, with the freedom to experience those new emotions openly being her aphrodisiac, indulging her humanity, and yet that doesn't quite all the way get there and going past that ex. Because then that specter enters the picture beyond the shadowy memory of Features Creatures, and the utopian deconstruction gets shoved to the side on Sue Me, in favor of an ugly argument surrounding custody of her teenage daughter, complete with broad slams against patriarchal gender politics that might have been referenced on Body Memory as Kafkaesque and pointless in comparison with her techno-naturalistic Utopia, but they feel a little bit lacking in that deeper weight here, and they ring as resoundingly bitter, not really fitting in, and a bit awkward against this production. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against the feminist undercurrent of this record. It works wonderfully on Saint in the framing of music of having that female presence, but this pivot, it feels stunningly stiff, blunt, but lacking the inclusivity of the subtext that she tried to interweave into her own musical Utopia. It's almost kind of ironic, wherein dissecting utopias of art and love in her themes in order to build a better one, this record skids into that same territory criticized by its own subtext, all with the best of intentions. And yet, this doesn't happen intentionally, which can't help but undercut some of the nuance that colors songs like Tabula Rasa and the closer Future Forever. Both songs with strong text, but not enough self-awareness to really pay off a lot of the subtext throughout the rest of the album. And yeah, that does get a little bit distracting, a little discombobulating. But overall, as I said, I do like this album, but I don't love it. It's overlong and kind of flabby at points. The thematic deconstruction doesn't quite go far enough to support a utopian framework, even if there are points where it definitely gets damn close, and I'll admit that even if it did, I'm just not really a fan of utopian art as a whole. The humanistic confrontation and humility in the face of that proper transcendence where he has to pull away on Perfume Genius's No Shape earlier this year, it hit way harder for me. It had that much more relatable element that while Björk tries to emphasize eyes here, it still kind of gets deflected. But still, it's frequently gorgeous. Björk is one hell of a performer and easily the best composer and producer to keep Arca in line, and there are some truly stunning moments, which means I'm going to give this a strong 7 out of 10 and definitely a recommendation. No, for me it does not cut quite as hard as Volnicura, but Björk is once again at the cutting edge, and that's always a risky proposition. And on that basis alone, for a complex and really quite challenging listen, you're going to want to check this out. You won't regret it if you do. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine this might be controversial. Björk's fan base tends to be pretty diehard, and honestly, I would count myself as one of them. I consider this a strong album, but not among her best. But hey, if you want to buy it, links in the description below, and I got the poll up there, so I'm curious for all you to tell me how wrong I am, especially in comparison with the rest of her discography. Beyond that, if there's anything else I'm able to do to improve my presentation here, I'm all ears. If you guys want to support my channel or impact my schedule, the link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right there, but till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.